So good evening everyone, and welcome to all the participants, our Thomas that will present his lecture, to the translators, to the staff, to all people are here tonight. So the my first task is telling you how to have the translation. So please, if you go on the line below in your screen, you will see a globe on the right hand. Please click on the globe and choose your language. This is the first step of our evening, so you can hear what we will present. Then I want to remind you that while you hear the lecture, you can ask some questions, but pay attention. You have to write the question in the section, always in the line below, answer and questions. Please don't use chat. In the chat, you can write only to ask, only if you have problems, technical problems, about if you don't see or you don't hear, but please don't put the questions in that section. So our webinar will last 2 hours. 1 hour and 30, or more or less 1 hour and 30 or 40 will last the lecture that Thomas will present. And in the last 30 minutes, he will answer to your questions. And more or less, this is the structure of our work. I want to introduce to you Thomas. Thomas is one colleague from Germany. He lives in Mannheim, and he is not only a bioenergetic therapist, he is also a rolfer. And he is part of the international faculty of IIBA since 2015, and he works not in Germany, obviously, but in some other countries when invited to teach. And in the last years, he focused his interest on the anatomical foundation of bioenergetic analysis, and he worked a lot with traumatized clients and with people not heterosexual, as well as not cisgender identity. And I do not want to take some more time, and so I ask Thomas to begin his lecture. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Rosalia. Good evening. Buenas tardes. Bom dia. Buonasera. Bonsoir. Dobry večer und guten Abend. Before I start with my lecture, I would like to thank you, Rosaria, for supporting me by this talk with such a big, invisible audience. It's really a challenge to talk here in my office, in front of my laptop, knowing that around 1,000 or more people are listening to this webinar and questioning themselves what I'm talking about. I would like to thank as well the technicians and interpreters who are working in the background of this presentation, making this webinar possible and running fluently. Thank you to all of you who I could get to know during the last minutes. Furthermore, I would like to thank Nina Schubert from the office of the IIBA with her team who organized the series of webinar on a broader level. And at last, but not least, I would like to thank the teaching committee of the IIBA with its chair, Patrizia Moselli, for the idea of creating such a series of webinars and their trust that all will be possible and running well. I'm thrilled to be part of such a large group of people who did this almost all on a voluntary basis. Thank you. Another point I would like to mention before I start with my lecture is my art of PowerPoint presentations. I always choose a photo from my treasure trove of private pics as the cover page image, which sort of accompanies us throughout the presentation in the upper right corner. This time, I took a photo of a tree, which is one of very special trees in a forest called the Dancing Forest in the Oblast Kaliningrad of Russia on the Curonian Spit, where a lot of trees are growing very strangely. The reason why this is happening there is unknown. One probable reason is that there might be some poison in the ground or some pests who make the trees suffer and find the solution to grow like this. I decided to take this picture of a tree as a symbol of a probably similar severe illness and its solution. When you will follow my lecture, you will find out that this PowerPoint is very differently organized. At the beginning, when I quote a lot, I will have a lot of slides. Coming to the end of the presentation, there will be less and less slides. Sometimes there will only be headlines to give you a structure about what I'm still talking. And there's a last point you already got aware of, I would like to mention. I'm the first presenter of a webinar of this series who is neither a native English speaker nor raised in an area where English is one of the official languages. I hope you can understand my Dinglish and my German point of view and using this language. At least the first 2/3 of this presentation should be understandable because my colleague Susan Canner from New Hampshire gave me feedback to make this presentation comprehend. Thank you so much, dear Susan. So let's start. My first chapter is the psychopathic character structure in its development, placement of the psychopathic character structure in the theoretical framework of bioenergetic analysis. The psychopathic character structure revolves around the solution of the particular being of a person with such a theme. According to Lowen, a person with such a character structure differs from the others in that he cuts off all his or her feelings, distances him or herself from others by distancing him or herself from these feelings as well, and elevates her or himself above others through images of him or herself. This is seen as an adaptation of a person who experienced horror in his or her early years. Finally, the concept of psychopathic character structure also has a special place in depth psychology theory. Sigmund Freud developed 1905 his theory of sexual development on the basis of the erogenous zones of human orifices, and through them arrived at the conceptualizations of the oral, anal, and genital phase. Wilhelm Reich extended Freud's theory with his focus on masochism of the anal phase, rigidity of the genital phase. So masochistic and rigid became the new names of Reich's set of characters. Reich further developed these concepts around their physical frame of reference. Began with the presentation of the rigid character structure in his book, The Function of Orgasm, in 1927. In his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism in 1933, he describes in more detail the background and characteristics of the masochistic character structure. In the same year, in Character Analysis, he presents for the first time the various concepts of the character structure developed so far, in addition to the masochistic character structure and the various manifestations of the rigid character structure. The schizophrenic character structure appears here for the first time. In his first and groundbreaking work, The Language of the Body, in 1958, Alexander Lowen deepens the description of these structures, including a detailed description of the oral character structure. He thus completes the body-related descriptions of the Freudian concept of sexual development. He adds the schizophrenic character structure according to Reich and his own development of the concept of the schizoid character structure. Lowen gives this chapter about 25 pages. In 1967, he dedicates a whole book to this structure, The Betrayal of the Body. Almost 10 years later, in 1975, In Bioenergetics, Lowen describes for the first time the 5 classic character structures in 20 pages in total. Among them, for the first time, Lowen mentions the psychopathic character structure on 4 pages only. He starts his description with, "This character structure requires some words. It's the one character type that has not been described or analyzed in my previous studies. It can be a very complex structure, but for the sake of brevity and clarity, I will describe a simple form of this disturbance." Unfortunately, this passage was not part of the German translation, so that I wondered for a long time why the psychopathic character structure did not appear earlier and was described in more detail. I wondered if I had overlooked its description in earlier publications. Now, when I found it first described in Bioenergetics, I began to wonder instead, why is Lowen describing it only now? And why now? Perhaps it would have been better if I had asked myself what has happened in psychoanalytic theory development since Lowen's first book, so about 1950-something. One answer is found in the work of Margret Mahler. In the 1940s, the Austrian psychoanalyst became a member of the New York Psychoanalytic and Psychiatric Institute and worked with psychotic infants. From 1959, she also worked with non-psychotic infants about her observations with the different groups of children, she developed the theory of the separation individuation process. She published this theory partly in 1968 and completely in the book The Psychological Birth of the Human Infant in 1975. And what is the key point of the concept on PSC, the Psychopathic Character Structure, published in the same year? Disorders in the process of separation and individuation. But Lowen himself also continued to develop his work. In my opinion, his book, Narcissism, Denial of the True Self from 1985 is groundbreaking. In it, he presents the mechanism of how people come to be oblivious to their bodies and their impulses. And here, the psychopathic character structure reappears. It even gets a certain deepened appreciation. Lowen again writes about the PCS being different from the narcissistic personality in order to vividly present the basic concept of narcissism, which involves the splitting off and denying feelings. But it's not called psychopathic character structure anymore. It's now the psychopathic personality. What Lowen succeeds in doing with the concept of narcissism is to develop a new dimension for the order of character structures through the phallic narcissistic, via the narcissistic and the borderline personalities, to the psychopathic personality and the psychotic personality. For Lowen, these personalities disorders are the increasingly massive narcissistic. All later elaborations on the classic character structures contain more and more differentiated descriptions of the individual concepts, including the psychopathic character structure. However, they are no longer written by Lowen himself, but by different authors. Thus, in my opinion, the psychopathic character structure remains in a certain stepchild mode, as the last of the classical character structures and as a transition to the modern character structures to narcissism, such as the narcissistic and the borderline personality. Sorry, this was too quick. This marginalized status of the psychopathic character structure or personality is reinforced by the fact that Lowen writes about people with such a personality structure as not being open to therapeutic change and thus unlikely to want to come directly to our practices and work on themselves. It's a different matter if our workplace is in forensics or in social work with ex-offenders. On the other hand, people with psychopathic character structure are often indirectly part of our therapies. Many of the perpetrators to whom our clients were exposed in their former lives or still are today have such a structure or corresponding parts of it. In recent years, coaches in the German-speaking part of the internet have developed special support services for people who have been exposed to psychopathically structured perpetrators or who still have family ties to them. Furthermore, psychopathic parts in the form of introjections of the perpetrators often develop in people who have been victims of people with a psychopathic structure and are thus severely traumatized. They maintain this destructive effect on the relationship with these perpetrators by developing self-destructive behavior. So today in this webinar, I will focus on the description and etiology of the psychopathic character structure and the concept of psychopathic personality used in general psychiatry. This will also include a brief presentation of the bioenergetic concept of narcissism that underlies PCS. Of course, we will also look at possible interventions for psychopathic aspects in bioenergetic analysis. So let's come to the next chapter, the definition and description of the concept of psychopathic character structure. If I am going to be dealing with people with PCS for the next hour and a half or so, how can we think of such a person? Because Lowen himself hasn't written all that much about people with psychopathic character structure, I'll quote him here in a bit more detail. The essence of the psychopathic character attitude is the denial of feelings. This attitude contrasts with the schizoid character who dissociates from his feelings. In the psychopathic personality, the ego or mind turns against the body and its feelings, especially the sexual feelings. That is why the term psychopathology arose. The normal function of the ego is to support the body striving for pleasure, not to subvert it in favor of an ego image. There is in all psychopathic character a great investment in one's image. The other aspect of this personality is the drive for power and the need to dominate and control. The reason why this character type is complex is that there are two ways to gain power over others. One is by bullying or overpowering another, in which case, if one does not challenge the bully, one becomes, in a sense, his victim. The second way is by undermining a person through a seductive approach, which is very effective against naive people who fall into the psychopath's power. In his book, Narcissism, Lowen describes further that all psychopathic personalities consider themselves superior to other people and show a degree of arrogance. Sorry, I have that as well here. Show a degree of arrogance that verges on contempt or common humanity. Particularly characteristic for psychopathic personalities is a tendency to act out, often in an antisocial way. They will lie, cheat, steal, even kill without any sign of guilt or remorse. Murder in cold blood is an extreme example of psychopathic acting out. But acting out per se is not limited to antisocial behavior. Alcoholism, drug addiction, or promiscuous sexual behavior may all be regarded as forms of acting out. Further quote of Lowen: it's significant, for instance, that psychopathic personalities show a need for instant gratification, an inability to contain desire or tolerate frustration. According to Lowen, this lack of skills is reflecting the deficient sense of self. In other aspects, namely in their ability to manipulate people, organize and promote schemes, and attract followers, psychopathic personalities are anything but infantile. Further on, he says, A psychopathic personality needs someone to control, and though he may seemingly control that person, he is also dependent on him. Thus, there is a degree of orality in all psychopathic individuals. In the psychiatric literature, they have been described as having an oral fixation. Hence, we are going to be dealing here with very antisocial, power-hungry, or at least seductive people. Reich and Lowen based the concepts of character structures they developed on diagnosis of mental disorders. Thus, if we look at the diagnosis of psychopathic disorder used in the psychiatric field, the question arises here: are Lowen's ideas about people with psychopathic character structure comparable to what is otherwise understood by a psychopathic person in psychological terminology and research? To anticipate the answer, we find a great deal of correspondence here with the psychopathic character structure. In the ICD-10, the Worldwide Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, psychopathic personality disorder is subsumed under dissocial personal disorder number F60.2. Dissocial personality disorder is defined here as follows: a personality disorder characterized by disregard for social obligations and callous uninvolvement in feelings for others. There is a significant discrepancy between the behavior and prevailing social norms. Behavior appears incapable of change due to adverse experiences, including punishment. There's a low tolerance for frustration and a low threshold for aggressive, including violent behavior, a tendency to blame others, or to offer superficial rationalizations for behavior that has placed the patient in conflict with society. They go on further with their symptoms list. At least 3 of the following characteristics or behaviors must be present: disengagement with the feelings of others, clear and persistent irresponsible attitude and disregard for social norms, rules, and obligations, inability to maintain lasting relationships, although there is no difficulty in entering into them, very low frustration tolerance and low threshold for aggressive, including violent behavior, lack of guilt, ability to learn from negative experience, especially punishment, marked tendency to blame others or to offer plausible rationalizations for one's own behavior that has placed the individual in conflict with society. So psychopathy is understood in psychiatry as a severe form of that dissocial personality disorder. It's not surprising that forensic science in particular is concerned with psychopathic personality disorder. Here, the Canadian criminal psychologist Robert Hare has developed a set of instruments that are used to differentiate between prison inmates and to predict their recidivism. I go into some depth here in my remarks about the construction of the scale in order to make the results of its use in science more understandable further on. Oh, sorry. I want to shorten this. I will be quick here. Hare's psychopathic checklist revised distinguishes two factors of psychopathy with a total of 20 criteria to be met. Here's the one factor, interpersonal affective. I go here quick. And another one with antisocial deviant. You will see that all the items which are here called are named are pretty close to the diagnosis we found in the ICD-10 earlier. We have here two other items which are not fit to the two subtypes. But what I want to show you is that Hare rated these items on the 3-point scale. That means 0 means item doesn't apply, 1 means an item applies somewhat, and 2, an item definitely applies. The items are rated on the basis of the person's lifetime functioning and not solely on the basis of the person's present state. This state may be atypical of his or her usual functioning due to extreme situational factors or an exacerbation of acute psychopathology. The items are summed to yield total scores ranging from 0 to 40. That reflects the degree to which an individual resembles the prototypal psychopath. Scoring items requires clinical judgment and inference, as well as the ability to carry out the task in an objective, professional manner. A cutoff score of 25 or greater is used to diagnose psychopathy. Using the scale, it has been possible to conduct various studies on people with psychopathic disorder. For example, it was found that in North American prisons, males had a mean score of 22.87 on this point scale, while females had a mean score only of 12.10. Age and intelligence scores, meanwhile, revealed no significant differences. Less than 5% of the population have high scores on the scale. Hare estimates that the proportion of people diagnosed as psychopaths is as low as 1%. So even from a statistical perspective, it's no wonder that we encounter few people with PCS in our private practices. While compared to this, 7 to 39% of worldwide populations are diagnosed as suffering from depression. In comparison, however, 15 to 20% of US prison inmates have been diagnosed as psychopathic. These account for 50% of all serious offenses. Thus, the PCLR score is used primarily in forensic psychiatric evaluations and has high predictive power with respect to the likelihood of recidivism in violent offenses. This is 80% for psychopaths, that means a score higher than 30, 62% for moderate psychopathy, and 31% for non-psychopaths. These results also reinforce Lowen and Gitonella's experience that people with psychopathic character structure rarely seek therapeutic treatment and won't profit from it. According to Hare, there is another group in which psychopaths are more prevalent. Among other things in his book Snakes in Suits, When Psychopaths Go to Work, he describes the specifics of management personnel in the economy. Thus, according to Hare, psychopathic behaviors such as dominance and manipulation are misinterpreted as leadership qualities by human resource managers. Ultimately, however, this does not only apply, Lowenzeit's Alan Harrington, a science who worked on psychopathic personality. Instead of murdering others, this person might become a corporate raider and murder companies, firing people instead of killing them, and chopping up their functions rather than their bodies. One could therefore assume that the unsuccessful psychopaths end up in prison and the successful ones in the executive suits. Ultimately, however, this does not only apply to the executive floors of business. People with psychopathic personality disorders can also be found in politics. Adolf Hitler is often cited as a prime example. But even among today's despots and warmongers, the proportion of psychopathic personality disorder is probably quite high. In recent years, with constant lying, the languages have been eroded. Thus, they resemble the language of George Orwell in 1984. The phrase "war is peace" is not used yet, but war has become a military special operation. Lies have become alternative facts. State law is manipulated and suspended, for example, by annexing territories of foreign states, though unconstitutional referendums, and then declaring martial law there just as illegally. But whether we can say that political psychopaths are dependent on other people is hard to imagine. I read a quote about psychopaths, the source of which I unfortunately can't remember, but which reflects the callousness well. It goes something like this. When they've burned $1 million per day, they go home quietly and sleep as usual. No more addiction rings through there. Psychopaths are also frequently the focus of plays and theaters and films. One of the most famous examples is the drama Gaslight and its film adaptation from 1944. In the term gaslighting, the title has since entered common parlance. Gaslighting was once referred to manipulation to extreme as to induce.
He's talking about the movie. Look at this. Come and see.
To induce mental illness or to justify commitment of the gaslighted person to a psychiatric institution, but is now used more generally. Quoting Wikipedia. In order to introduce you to an example of a psychopathic character in a little more detail here, I would like to tell you the gist of the play or film Gaslight.
You could talk about the film.
Yes, I talk about the film, Vincentia.
Good.
In the film's prequel, the psychopath Sergis, played by Charles Boyer, first gains the trust of a rich singer. He then murders her in order to get his hands on her famous diamonds. After failing to find them, he tracks down the singer's niece and heiress Paula, played by Ingrid Bergman. He introduces himself to her as Gregory and gains her trust as well. The very young woman falls head over heel in love with him. At his insistence, they marry just 2 weeks later. Afterward, Gregory persuades Paula to move with him to her aunt's apartment in London, even though she doesn't like the city and hardly know anyone there. To help calm Paula's anxiety over the memory of her aunt's violent murder, Gregory suggests storing her aunt's old furnishing in the attic. After the aunt's belongings are locked away in the attic, events become bizarre. At the Tower of London, Paula cannot find an heirloom brooch that Gregory had given her, although it had been stored safely in her handbag. A picture disappears from its place on a wall, and Gregory says that Paula took it and other items, then returned them. Paula has no recollection of doing this. Paula also hears footsteps coming from the sealed attic and notices the gas lights dim and brighten for no apparent reason. Gregory suggests it's only her imagination. Gregory gradually isolates his wife from the outside world, claiming it's beneficial for her nerves. He accuses her of becoming a kleptomaniac and claims that her mother died in an asylum. He's also jealous and accusatory whenever others express an interest in her. When Gregory does take her to a party, he shows Paula his watch chain, saying his watch has mysteriously disappeared. Gregory finds it in her handbag. Paula becomes hysterical in front of guests and Gregory takes her home. Paula begins to believe she should not go out in public. Their young maid Nancy worsens the situation as Paula becomes convinced that Nancy loathes her. Gregory tells Paula that she's paranoid and is imagining the maid's disdain, while he secretly flirts with Nancy. He has been secretly rummaging through the dead singer's belongings in the attic to find the jewels, which he believes are there. The footsteps Paula heard in the attic were his. The flickering gas lights, which the claims she imagined, were caused by his turning on the attic lights, thus reducing the gas to the downstairs lamps. The kleptomania exhibited by Paula is all sleight of hand by Gregory. Gregory employs a cunning strategy to convince his wife that she's going mad, hoping to have her institutionalized, giving him power of attorney over her and allowing him to search uninhibited for the jewels. The plan almost succeeds. If you want to see the solution out of that nightmare, you have to watch the movie. If this description has helped you better to understand a person with PCS, the next question is, how do you recognize people with a PCS by their physical appearance? Let's see if we can fill the mirror. Lowen describes two body types corresponding to the two types of psychopathic expression in sense of bullying versus manipulative or seductive. The bullying type generally has an oral character's body, including a pelvis that is shifted forward and hip bones that are tilted backward. Now I'm sorry that it's not a PowerPoint, because then you could see it more easily in which direction it is meant if I say a pelvis is shifted to the front. And you might also see that that the pelvis is tilted backwards. Again. In contrast to a person with an oral character structure, a person with a PCS pulls him or herself up, and thus his or her energy is also in his or her head. We also have had this phenomenon in people with a schizoid character structure. But in people with a schizoid character, the extreme tension in the head is caused by a high tension in the depth of the body that is around and in the spine and the brain. This traumatic tension leads to torpor. The resulting withdrawal from all people is functional consequence of this deep tension. Being in the head, rather a side effect. Persons with a PCS rather pull themselves up with their musculature and inflate themselves. They also raise themselves more above the others, and this is their core goal. They do this to gain power. As a result, their upper neck and diaphragm are blocked under strong tension, as are their ankles. Their body appears to be rather rigid overall, and their personality can be very cold due to the shutting off of any emotion. Lowen tried to put that in the graphic he developed to describe the psychopathic character structure, which you can see on this slide, but actually I see there's nothing. So let's go and try to move a little bit. But before I start to propose you any exercise in this webinar, I have to tell you that all what you are doing here is on your own risk. I don't think that the exercises which I propose here are doing harm. But I don't know you at all, nor that I have any possibilities to help you out of a process you don't feel well with. So please decide by yourself if you would like to try the exercise or better not. Both are good solutions. No one is better than the other. For insurance reasons, please pay attention to your physical safety during this exercise. We do not assume any guarantee or costs incurred by you from any damage caused by this exercise. But perhaps we could stretch a little bit and try to yawn to regulate ourselves after these 40 minutes or something of listening to me. Perhaps it helps stand up and turn around or bend over, or what you know already, what helps you to come out of a state of freeze or passivity. If you would like to try to embody the posture of Lowen's description of a bullying type of a person with psychopathic character structure, you can follow my description. If you don't want, you may only listen to me. A person with PCS has shifted the pelvis anterior that is to the front and tilts the pelvis posterior. That's backwards. So you can do it or not. This person pulls him or herself up, inhales and keeps the breath in. That means such a person can hardly exhale. The upper neck is stiff as well as the diaphragm and the ankles. All energy is pulled to the upper body, head included. If you do this exercise, how are you connected to the floor yet? How are you breathing? How are you connected to the space around you? What kind of relation do you have to the object in your room? Watch around. If you only listen to my words, how do you think is such a person connected to the floor? Breathing, connected to the space around, and the objects as well as persons in it. I think that's enough. Please, if you would like, shake your body softly, touch your skin wherever you can reach to it. Do some sighs or ahs. And see what kind of relief starts in you, how your connection to the ground is now, how your breathing is changing, how your connection to the space and to the objects around you is changing as well. If you would like to experience another exercise, you could search for a stool or chair or bed which is stable enough to step onto it. But please check if it is stable enough to step on it. And again, for insurance reasons, please pay attention to your physical safety during the exercise. We do not assume any guarantee or costs incurred by you from any damage caused by this exercise. If you would like to do the exercise and your support on the ground, like a stool, chair, or bed is stable, step on it. If you decide not to do the exercise, you may listen what I would ask such a person. If you are up there, how is the perspective of that person on this object? How does the person is connected to the ground, to the space, to the objects or persons around? Perhaps you can watch around. What kind of image the person might develop for his or herself by this stance? Perhaps you could find a word of description of the experience of this person, if it's you or only imagined. If you did the exercise, please step down from the object and check what changes yet. If you decided not to do the exercise, imagine what the step down of the person evokes in the person. How is the kind of relationship to the ground now? To the space? To the objects or persons in the room? Perhaps you could find another word of description of the experience of this person back down from the elevating object. If you would like, do some stretching, yawning, bend over, or what else you know might help you get out of positions of stress. Now we go further with the second type, the manipulative or seductive type. The manipulative type, on the other hand, is more flexible, although also severely cut off in the diaphragm region. For these persons, it's not so important to look down on others from above. They use their erotic energy to seduce their counterpart and thereby gain power over them. Like the psychopath Sergis Gregory in the movie Gaslight, they can be very charming and superficially affectionate. People of the manipulative type often have charisma because they have a highly developed ability to observe emotions in other people and imitate them perfectly over time. But how does a psychopathic character structure develop in a person? Oops, something is not right. Let's check. Oh, sorry, there's one slide missing. I stay here. If one follows Lowen, this character structure is based on a massive narcissistic disorder, as I already told. The term narcissism has developed in psychoanalytic teaching over a long period of time since Freud. Kernberg's definition of narcissism is one of the most developed. Lowen summarizes it as follows. It should be here. Let's see. Yeah. Kernberg points to the young child's fusion of ideal self, ideal objects, and actual self-images as a defense against an intolerable reality in the interpersonal realm. Quote end. Narcissists get hung up on their image. That's Lowen. Lowen himself disagrees here. He writes, I equate the self with the living body, which includes the mind. The sense of self depends on the perception of what goes on in the living body. Perception is a function of the mind and creates images. If the body is the self, the actual self-image must be a bodily image. One can only discard the actual self-image by denying the reality of an embodied self. Further, Lowen writes, I would define the narcissist as a person whose behavior is not motivated by feeling. Thus, Lowen's contribution is to give the concept of narcissism a physical basis. According to it, the true self is the body as described above. Elsewhere, Lowen uses the hand to describe the self. In this image, the self-image is the globe that encloses the hand. If the body is neglected, we no longer have access to the hand, but only to the glove. This glove can then be further developed so that it reflects a person's desire or ideal about a hand than to the hand itself. Finally, when the glove no longer, it represents the false self. According to Lowen's theory of narcissism, any character structure can ultimately be understood on this basis, as a specific distancing from bodily experience in each case. In his book Narcissism, he presents a number of different disturbance patterns which he explicitly orders from relatively healthy to extremely disturbed. As I showed you already before, we find the psychopathic personality just before the paranoid or schizophrenic. That is, as a massive and significantly more disturbed structure than the actual narcissistic. But how do people with PCS come to lose touch with the body? Perhaps we will find it if we follow Lowen with his question, but why are the narcissist's eyes so dull? Lowen gives the answer immediately afterwards. Whoops. It's the experience of horror in the home situation. And further he writes, we need to know exactly what horror is and what events in a home give rise to it. Here for Lowen, the distinction between terror and horror is important. He sees the terror meets the person, him or herself, and thus triggers a shock in the person, which can lead to the schizoid character structure. In comparison, horror is violence that is witnessed but aimed to another person. Another way of saying this is that witnessing terror that strikes another person would be horror for the person witnessing it. Horror leads to a denial of what has been experienced together with the feelings that go with it. This must not be true becomes this cannot be true becomes this is not true. And finally, is what? The experienced is split off here. Lowen summarizes, in a situation of horror, all of us have tendency to disbelieve our senses because they contradict our image of reality. To question our sense of reality make us feel disoriented and crazy. Instead, to protect our sanity, we dissociate our experience. It becomes unreal, a bad dream. And he goes further in this quote, how does it lead to a narcissistic disturbance? If the experience of horror is a solitary one, the dissociation is limited to that situation. But if the horror is continuous, if one lives in such a situation, the dissociation becomes structured in one's body as a split between the perceptual functions of the mind and the central functions of the body. Denying one's emotions becomes a habit engraved in the personality. Action is taken solely on the basis of reason and logic. One lives in a world divorced from feeling. Indeed, the world of feeling is seen as unreal and therefore allied to insanity. Although such a person knows about feelings, he or she cannot let go to feelings, that is, allow them to dictate behavior. In his early comments on psychopathic character structure, Lowen focuses more on the timing of the psychological injury. Gitonella and others here focus on the period of individuation and rapprochement, which is similar to the stages and their crisis that Margaret Mahler, which I mentioned before, developed her theory of the child's separation and individuations. Shortly before Lowen's publication. Mahler lays foundations for object relations theory by showing how the relationship between the caregiver, that's the object, and the child develops during this period. According to Mahler's observations, during the individuation phase, the child not only develops further motor skills so that the child physically is mobile and can move away from the mother, cognitive and emotional abilities also emerge, which, if developed well, lead to emotional object constancy. This is the base for the further development of the relationship with the mother and the child's increasing ability to regulate him or herself emotionally. For this, it's central importance that the mother repeatedly offer attuned physical contact. This leads to the child's ability to reach out and to check back and possibly make physical contact with the mother. Coming more and more to the etiology of people with a psychopathic character structure, Lone follows the authors of the object relationship theory who are highlighting the essence of factors that lead to narcissistic or psychopathic behavior. If, for example, there are power games between the parents, the children are often used as weapons in these conflicts. When parents separate, sometimes their needs change. In either case, the child may be upgraded to my little man or even prince, as well as my little woman or the princess, which shifts the actual structure of the relationship. The children are thereby overtaxed and can be emotionally and cognitively abused. In healthy developmental behavior, children are supported to do more than they have done in the past. For example, walking and therefore physically being in the world in a new way is an important developmental step. The task of the caregivers here is to both affirm and set limits as the child explores more of the world. Taking an interest in what the children have found and brought with them is an important affirmation of their newly discovered abilities. But exploiting their new capacities and taking advantage of them, for by example, asking them to bring one's slippers, goes beyond acknowledging the children's new abilities and forms of experience. If instead of providing the necessary support for the development of the object constancy, the caregiver manipulates the child for his or her own good, he or she abandons the child's development and harms him or her in several ways. For not only does she or he thereby not support the development described above, but the caregivers begins to distort reality on the physical and emotional level. Loving attention is replaced by manipulative exploitation. The exploitation is frequently concealed with words of kindness. This leads to the equation seduction is love, later in the child's development. The recognition as an independent being is thus denied to the child. Thus, the child is kept in a dependent state. That's likely why Lone uses the term betrayal for this exploitation. Lone describes it this way. The most important factor in the etiology of this condition is a sexually seductive parent. The seduction is covert and is done to meet the parent's narcissistic needs. It aims to tie the child to the parent. A seductive parent is always a rejecting parent on the level of the child's need for support and physical contact. The lack of the necessary contact and support accounts for the oral element in this character structure. What Lone also takes up here is the idea within object relations theory that fathers or second caregivers become important as part of the family triad in the pre-Oedipal phase. This is because the second attachment figure facilitates the child's individuation, potentially facilitating the child's experience of joy and aliveness, given the protection and security that can be provided even without a mother. However, if this trait is disturbed by power games between the partners, or if it does not exist at all due to separation or divorces, the second attachment figure can no longer have a balancing effect. Lowen then sees rather the seductive relationship creates a triangle which puts the child in the position of challenging the parent of the same sex. This creates a barrier to the necessary identification with the parent of the same sex and furthers an identification with the seductive parent. In this identification with the seducing parent, Lowen sees the origin of the psychopathic character structure through the internalization of the perpetrator's behavior and the perpetrator's structure behind it. Lying is the new reality, seducing love, putting oneself above the other is the new safe form of contact, and stealing is seen as rightfully taken for oneself because one is above things and rules. As a result, the child does not identify with the second caregiver, who in a healthy development supports the child in discovering his or her own needs. Due to this lack of support, the child's own needs are not pursued further. These needs do not come into focus at all. They are switched off as along with the perception of the body. Also, the child's perception of the parents and the rest of the world is denied and split off. Thus, the child can endure the horror which Lowen described or accept it by experiencing himself as powerful in it. Having talked so much about narcissistic and psychopathic, now the question comes up, what distinguishes a psychopathic personality from a narcissistic one? In Lowen's listing of the different personalities regarding narcissism, it's clear that people with a psychopathic character structure are more narcissistic and thus more megalomaniacal and have weaker egos, a stronger lack of feeling, lack of sense of self, and lack of contact with reality than the person with a narcissistic personality. One could also say that the distortion of reality here runs deeper. In other words, the narcissist without feelings is trapped in his fantasies and images, but he or she knows that these are images and that there is another world. In comparison with a person with PCS who thinks he or her ideas and images are reality, or at least sees others' realities as irrelevant. Quote Lowen, "The imposter who believes he's a nobleman is a psychopath, for whom subjective reality has displaced the objective reality of his birth. The narcissistic character is more in touch with objective reality, but is dominant by the image." According to Lowen, the psychopathic personality seems to have no sense of the difference between right or wrong on a feeling level. This is a person without a conscience, or, in psychoanalytic terms, someone who lacks a superego. There is no guilt. Thus, the goal of the behavior of the person with PCS is also different from the goal of the behavior of a person with a narcissistic personality. According to Lowen, a person with a narcissistic personality seduces in order to gain recognition, whereas a person with a psychopathic character structure seduces in order to manipulate. I won't discuss narcissistic personality furthermore, as it will receive its own presentation in a second webinar series. Lowen describes the psychopathic character structure further. There is also a masochistic element in the psychopathic personality, resulting from the submission to the seductive parents. The child could not rebel or walk away from the situation. Its only defense was internal. The submission is only on the surface. Nevertheless, to the degree that the child submits openly, he gains some measure of closeness with the parent. The masochistic element is strongest in the enticing or seductive variety of the character structure. The initial gambit is to move into a relationship in a masochistically submissive role. Then, when the enticement has worked and the attachment of the other person is secure, the role is reversed and a sadistic quality emerges. What Lowen deduces is psychopathic personalities must have someone who needs them. They cannot be alone, and the relationship must be one in which they have control. Actually, I still cannot understand how Lowen concludes that such a disturbed person develops out of a family without more dysfunction and cruelty than he describes. People with psychopathic character structure trample and even mock all humanity without realizing it emotionally and therefore remain cold in the process. My own experience with psychopathic character structure so far is mainly through the clients who were exposed to such people. Here I can state that these clients were traumatized by living through very early and long-lasting sexual abuse or massive physical and sexual violence within their families. Whenever these clients progressed in their bioenergetic processes, inner voices begin to speak up. These voices shut my clients down by saying, "It's useless. You don't think anyone will believe you. You're just acting. He, your therapist, is only fooling you. He'll kick you out anyway. You'll see. Next time, he'll terminate your therapy." These are perpetrators' introjects of the relatives or non-family perpetrators of the clients. They show the distortion of the reality in which the clients have grown up and which they have absorbed. This massive perversion, that is distortion, is normally the situation that would lead a child to develop a psychopathic character structure. But again, in contrast to this, a lot of my clients are deeply traumatized with only perpetrators' introjects. Recent neurological research is coming to conclusions that prefrontal, temporal, and limbic regions differ in people with psychopathy from other people. These regions are involved in emotional and learning processes. Various researchers therefore assume, among other things, that people with psychopathy react less to pain and thus punishment is less effective for people with psychopathy as a learning method. So they support Richard Hare's findings. This is a first indication of the low capacity for change in people with psychopathy and shows how deeply the physical structure might be altered in people with psychopathy. At the same time, psychological research currently finds almost equal measures of genetic and environmental influences in people with psychopathy. Thus, it's currently unclear whether psychopathy is inherited rather than learned. I'm coming to the last chapter about working with clients with psychopathic issues. In Lowen's case, the effects of therapeutic work with people with PCS seem sobering. Quote, "This extreme lack of human fellow feeling makes psychopathic personalities very difficult to treat." As already mentioned at the beginning, colleagues from the forensic field also see the treatment of people with a diagnosis of psychopathy as extremely limited, if not completely questioned. However, if we look at the history of psychotherapy, there have always been diagnoses of people which were considered as incurable. Narcissism was one of them before the development of object relation therapy, a theory, and people with borderline disorder before the development of dialectical behavioral therapy. So why shouldn't people with psychopathic character structure be effectively treated at some point? However, whether bioenergetics therapists will succeed in doing this, the future will show. For bioenergetic work, however, it's important to distinguish here whether we are dealing with people with psychopathic character structure in our practice, or whether only issues with psychopathic conflicts arise with them. What is the difference here? Let's take a look at another field of psychotherapy, depression. "I'm depressed" has now entered our vernacular. It no longer has anything to do with the diagnosis of depression. Rather, it means to be glum, perhaps unenthusiastic. Being glum or reluctant to do anything, however, is certainly an issue for these people. On the other hand, there are people who suffer from mild or moderate depression, unfortunately, and are so diagnosed by doctors and psychotherapists. They may be helped by a change in diet, behavior, or even in the structures of their relationships. Thus, clients with such an episode can sometimes even develop joy and vital energy again after a short-term therapy. A distinction must be made between mild or moderate depression on one hand or severe depression. The latter usually needs medical treatments, easily becomes chronic, and leads to early retirement from work. Just as the disorder depression can manifest itself to varying degrees in a person, other symptoms such as anxiety, narcissism, and psychopathy can also manifest themselves to varying degrees. On a physiological basis, this could be described as follows. We speak of character structures when a behavior is characterized by the fact that it develops at a point in early childhood. It develops from the experience of an inner conflict in which neither one nor the other of two competing solution strategies could be chosen. A process of repression sets in. The physical part of the repression involves the chronic fixation of the tense muscular that was needed to perform one of the non-chosen actions of the nervous system. The chronically tense musculature is partly transformed into fascia for energy economic reasons. Only when we find fascial consolidations due to these events to the body, we can finally speak of a character structure. This may help understand the results of neurological research with differences even in the brain of a person with psychopathy. When a person is preoccupied with the psychopathic issue only, it may be that the same muscles are activated and thus tense in him as in a person with PCS. However, compared to the person with psychopathic character structure, these are also relaxable again and thus not part of his structure. Thus, in the course of our lives, psychopathic impulses and problems can also arise in each of us, which can then also become part of and a topic in therapy. Gitonella summarizes the situation slightly differently. Quote, "It's rare for a psychopathic character to request therapy. Instead, we see patients in therapy who may have psychopathic traits or tendencies. They come to therapy because something is collapsing inside them and causing anxiety to emerge. Anxiety of depression or anxiety of madness, although they are rarely fully aware of it. Their anxiety comes from the conflict between their over-invested image and the feelings that are trying to make their way inside them. The anguish is itself most of the time the consequence of a repetitive failure. Failure in the capacity to build a desired and durable couple life. Failure in the fact of maintaining good health, taking alcohol or drugs in great quantity. Sometimes social failures and conflicts with the justice. These failures end up creating a breach in the defensive system and encourage questioning, or at best, an awareness that their omnipotence is being thwarted and that a certain vulnerability is emerging. It's an illusion that threatens to collapse and that puts them in danger. It's sometimes an illness that appears and brings out the symptomatic self. The first request is that the therapist helps them to restore their false self. To do this, he seeks to structure the therapeutic relationship by seducing the therapist, making him dependent on him and controlling the process. Gitonella also describes a brief therapy process that was possible with a client with a psychopathic character structure or trait for him. Quote, "This 40-year-old man came to me because he was beginning to feel violent impulses toward his third wife. He had been hospitalized a few times before for domestic violence. He had also undergone an alcoholic detoxification. He was overly ambitious, dreaming of becoming the CEO of the company that employed him, and was trying to enter politics. He remembered that when he was 2.5 years old and his parents separated, his mother said to him as she closed the door of the house after his father left, 'From now on, you are my little man.' He remembered the troubled look in that mother's eyes and the troubled feeling he had. During all the years of his childhood, he became the adored object of his mother, provided that he stayed close to her, that he cuddled her, who constantly repeated to him, "I love you, my little darling, and I will never leave you." On the other hand, she loved him passionately, looked at him with eyes that devoured him. When he took his bath, she washed him carefully, caressed him, looking into his eyes until he was embarrassed, and said to him, "You like that, don't you, little rascal?" During therapy sessions, when I asked him what he was feeling, he would respond with thoughts. It was difficult for him to have feelings. He came to therapy because his wife asked him to, and because he thought that suffering a third failure in love was socially wrong. He told me that he loved his wife and believed him. But what I perceived was that he was trying to seduce his wife and make her dependent on him, so that she would admire him and help him succeed in his ambitious life. This man also used me in therapy in a demanding way. He sought to flatter me so that I would flatter him back. He sought to be special in my eyes and sometimes let me imagine that I was special in his. He sought to show me his power and professional success so that I would admire him. But what I felt towards him was sorrow, compassion, and little by little tenderness towards this child in him who had suffered so much. So much so that he was moved by it and gradually began to have feelings, especially depressive feelings, but also love for me, this father he had not had. And then he became vulnerable, and this was intolerable for him. One day, after 6 months of therapy, during a session, he silently cried, letting out a few tears. He didn't come back the next time and, despite my signs, disappeared. I don't think he was ready to give up his manipulative power fantasies, even if it meant losing his third wife. Quote end. Besides working on psychopathic issues in our clients, the processing of the previously mentioned perpetrator interjects in our clients after the sexual abuse and violence experiences by people with PCS remains in therapy. Here it needs a persistence of the clarification of the function of these inner voices. For these voices always emerge as they did back then when perpetrators were threatened with exposure and then wanted to talk down the abuse with all their might and thus manipulate the child again. So the truth is always exactly the opposite of the message of the voices. That doesn't help means what you are doing right now is very effective. You are just acting means you're just getting very close to yourself and starting to feel yourself. Your therapist is just fooling you means contact with your therapist is just emerging. The clients can often only recognize that these internalized voices of the perpetrators really indicate progress by translating these messages again and again. Having just looked at various examples of how therapy can work with people with psychopathic aspects, perhaps the question arises, what helps us to find a clear strategy in dealing with clients in therapy? We have found that the psychopathic character structure is about a certain kind of disturbed object relationship. Thus, it might be helpful to look again more closely at the relationships with people with PCS, and especially at the dynamics as they show up in therapy in the form of transference and countertransference. If you look at what generally characterizes the relationships of people with PCS, we find here the striving for power and status, especially through devaluation and suppression, manipulation, lying and stealing combined with a loss of reality through the lack of feeling and of sense of self, as well as through an exaggerated orientation towards images, also about oneself, up to strong delusions of grandeur. Accordingly, these people bring these abilities into therapy and thus encounter us in a similar way in the form of their transference. From this dynamic, Lowen concludes no basic change in personality or character can occur if the patient is in control of the therapy. Patients must learn to give up control, he quotes in another one. They must learn to let their feelings and emotions move them, even allowing themselves to be carried away by their emotional responses. Otherwise, they will never know the glory of love and the exuberance of joy. But how can we help our clients to give up control? Perhaps the example of Gitonella quoted earlier will help us, in which he described the manipulation attempts of his client very precisely. In it, Guy also shows how he dealt with his countertransference. He perceived the manipulation attempts of his client. He does not seem to have reacted harshly and dismissively to these attempts at manipulation, and probably remained affectionate toward his child. Quote, again, but what I felt toward him was sorrow, compassion, and, little by little, tenderness toward this child in him who had suffered so much. But how did Gitonella discover the manipulation attempts? He writes nothing about it. If we want to move forward here, another question arises before the previous question about the abandonment of control. How do we perceive manipulation attempts so far? Perhaps this is a little different for everyone. So I would propose another little exercise on this. Please remember, it's up to you to participate. If you decide not to do it, it's worth the same. Maybe you can take a moment and stretch and loll a little bit. Exhale deeply and sigh. After listening to so many words, this should not be difficult for you. Maybe there is the possibility to lie down or sit down somewhere comfortable and feel for a moment how you are supported by the ground and how the air makes you breathe. I then just imagine someone coming up to me and smiling at me, but I perceive that the smile is a false one. When you hear that, what is the first thing that happens to you on a physical level? I notice at me that something tightens in my belly, as if I'm protecting myself from what's coming that I don't want. The tension starts at the tip of my sternum, and I breathe more shallowly. It's probably the diaphragm. Or maybe it's the rectus abdominis, this six-pack muscle, which get tenser. That's the first impulse that tells me, be on guard, be alert. So an alarm goes off too. and I tend to take a step back inside and become suspicious. What do you sense for yourself? Take a moment to trace it. How to stand on the way against manipulations. I'm not saying that this always happens within you when you perceive that you are in danger of being manipulated. But you could use this current perception as a hypothesis, which you could test again and again in the near future. So you could find out if you react to it physically in this way in the future. In this way, you could gain experience and, if necessary, develop a set of embodied counter-transferences to situations of manipulation. But to be quite honest, when manipulation attempts have been good so far, I usually fall for them. Even with jokes like, "Oh, look, there's a wasp sitting on your shoulder." Don't we often automatically turn right around there, guided entirely by our autonomic nervous system? What can I do when it strikes me, if it strikes me that I have been manipulated? I can notice it. Afterwards, I can then either cover up the manipulation or squirm in shame and try to change the subject, or get angry, or laugh about it. Maybe this short analysis already helps us. First of all, it's important to notice a manipulation, even if we have fallen for it. This shows us and our counterpart that we have noticed the manipulation very well and take it seriously. Only then can we change something. If we then cover up the manipulation, people with psychopathic character structure know that we ourselves are stuck in manipulation and power games and are not free here. If we squirm in shame, they know that we can become another victim of their manipulations. If we get angry, they know they can become a victim again and needs to protect themselves even more. If we laugh, they know we have enough containment to hold us and maybe them. Laughter, of course, only works when we are not deeply hurt, as in the case of a joke, or perhaps a little more. During my first visit to the international conference of the IIBA in Salvador de Bahia, I had made the acquaintance of a colleague from Norway. With her, I discovered the city in its more remote neighborhoods the day after the conference. There we met a boy of about 5 years who held out his hand to us and asked for us for alms. I did not know how to react. This is not common in Germany. So I was surprised and ashamed. Should I give him money? And if so, how much? My colleague just started laughing loudly and said to the boy, "Bon dia," and went on. At that point, I was even more confused and asked her why she laughed. She said he was trying it on. He would have worn clothes that would have shown he was not poor, but he would have tried to see if he could beg successfully. Her laughter clarified the situation for everyone, and with her bon dia, she showed the boy what behavior on his part would have been appropriate for such a situation. How did she know all this? She was a social worker and worked with children and young people. What does this example show us? It's about detecting the manipulation, reporting it back in an appropriate setting, the laughter, and offering a regulation of the previous behavior right after, the bon dia. So it's about creating authenticity in the encounter. As I said, this is not a new achievement in social work with children. It has long been known that behavior change can only occur when misbehavior is promptly punished. This also applies where appropriate to legal punishment for violations of the law. Also from dealing with mobbing at the workplace, one knows that naming the smoldering psychotherapy at the workplace is the first step to escape this damaging situation, which at the beginning is mostly intangible.
Sorry, Thomas, we have only 10 minutes and we have some questions.
Okay. Can I have 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
To finish? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Not only in the manipulative violence exposed by this naming and obvious to all, the manipulated person is strengthened by standing up for him or herself. It gives the manipulative person a chance to become aware of his or her attempts at manipulation. This gives them an impulse to investigate where they know such a way of dealing with others or even with themselves. As we know, people with PCS know both situations. The child was the manipulated person. The adult is the manipulating one. A disclosure in therapy creates a situation in which both parts of the client are taken seriously. Referring to our situation in bioenergetic therapy, we would say that it's important to name suspected manipulation attempts first.
So,
I would like to give a little bit of another thing. It is another aspect important in bioenergetic work with people with a psychopathic theme. If we look at the narcissistic background of the PCS, it becomes clear that such people do not feel themselves. So we have to train the access of the body. And perhaps we can find here some questions to that to make that clear to the end.
So, Thomas, thank you very much for your lecture and for the big work that you offer us. So I have some questions for you.
Yeah.
And the first one is, could you tell us some exercise for trust and humiliated oral needs?
About trust, I think one is an exercise where we can trust into the floor. If we are sitting on a high stool, which needs that we put our feet off the floor, we can try to come a little bit more closer and closer that at a certain point we fall on our feet. There is a moment where we get really excited, almost anxious in that moment when we fall down. And I have good experiences with that because people can try and find out that this can be joyful to have that situation of trusting into the falling. This is a little one. I think it's pretty common and known that we have also the possibility to stay in front of a mattress and to lean forward, lean forward, lean forward till we fall down on the mattress. This is the next step where we could go. And I think that has a lot to do with trusting into the floor.
Thank you, Thomas. Another one. How can a psychopathic person to be led to seek therapy?
I think it was in there what I quoted from Guy, that it has often to be something where they can gain a profit from, even it's a longer lasting relationship, or that they can come out of prison earlier or something else like that. But I think this is really a difficult thing, and for me it would be more the question how we can keep them. And I hope that I made that clear, that it's about being authentic in our relationship with them, that we show them the boundaries where they cross them, and that we don't let them do that. And on the other hand, that we show our respect and empathy for their being hurt.
Thank you, Thomas. Another one. Is it possible to treat or to touch anyway a PSC?
I go more for the second one, to touch. I guess that's really difficult. It's not that you shouldn't do it. I have in my mind a client with whom I had this situation very often, but it was always that when we came into contact, into body contact, I felt that there is a manipulative part in that. And then it's important to talk about that. If the situation with the client is stable like that you could do it. So it's really difficult to find that situation, to come into a situation where you can trust each other, that there is a relationship developing, and then that you can give feedback also on a more distant or on a level where you make clear that they have to stop their manipulation.
Thank you. Another one. Could you please say something more to the vice versa connection of PCS with depression?
With depression?
Yeah. The vice versa connection.
Yeah. That's difficult, because actually it was a part of the example of Guy's story with his client. And of course, I mean, we don't have to forget that normally people with a psychopathic theme or psychopathic character structure even, they don't feel anything. So they are really in their mindset, in their images. So, but we know that there is a deep hurting. And as we know as bioenergetic therapists, if people are coming into process, that they can really start to feel more of them. For the person with a psychopathic character structure, that's horror. So that's really dangerous for them. And of course, they try to stop that as far as possible. And so if something is coming up, then it might be the first anxiety or depression.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. The last questions.
Okay.
How to help people who have lived with and have been victims of psychopathic people? So, how to help people who have lived with and have been victims of psychotic people? I don't know if it's psychotic or psychopathic.
Yeah. As I told at the end, I think it helps a lot to work on this perpetrator's introjections or introjects, that we make clear that we are aware of these voices which are coming up, that you bring that more. I had this morning a client with whom I came there, and I told her, listen, if you see this, that it means the opposite. And it was that she was, the voice said, you are guilty because you let the man do something with you. And I told her, listen, do you know what the opposite of that is? And she said that the others are guilty. And I said, yes, and that you are not guilty. And then she said, and then comes anger and disgust. So it was very quick that all of a sudden, in a person who normally doesn't feel anything in her body and only little on an emotional level, that she could start to turn that around and come into contact with her, with herself.
So, thank you very much, Thomas. You did a very big work, and I see in the chat that your work has been appreciated a lot by the participants. You received a lot of congratulations for your
Thank
work.
you.
And I don't know, probably you could read the chat later.
No.
I don't know. No, you do not want. Well,
Not at
I
all.
tell you that it was a success.
Yeah.
So we finished, she finished our time
Yeah.
for tonight webinar. As you know, we have some more in the future. I'm sure that the participants will participate in the future to the others one, because I see that there is a big enthusiasm, I don't know, to all these webinar. So I want to tell thank you to Patrizia Moselli, who wanted to organize them, who worked a lot to achieve these results. And so thank you very much to all the present, to the staff, and to you, Thomas. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Rosaria, for standing by me. It was very helpful to have you aside. Thank you, and have a good evening. See you again. Bye-bye.
Ciao.